Walt Purdy had not planned to stop at Hennessy's. He had come to Sheridan on a Thursday in October of 1973 for fence wire and a new hydraulic fitting for the hayloader, and a prescription his wife had called ahead to the pharmacy. And the list in his shirt pocket had nothing on it that required stopping at a saddle shop. He had been coming to Sheridan for supplies since he was 19 years old, and could have driven the route from his place in Johnson County to every hardware and feed store in town without consulting a map. But in 40 years of making the trip, he had stopped at Hennessy's Saddle and Leather exactly twice before, once in 1951 when he needed a set of replacement stirrups, and once in 1964 when a bridle had cracked. He stopped this Thursday because of the sign. Closing sale was hand-lettered on a piece of cardboard in the window, and below it, in smaller letters, "Everything must go." Walt read this from the cab of his truck as he drove past, and then he pulled to the curb 50 feet past the shop and sat for a moment with the engine running and thought about the sign and about Hennessy's and about the specific quality of the word closing when it was applied to a place that had been on Main Street in Sheridan for as long as he could remember. He turned off the engine and went in. The inside of Hennessy's smelled of leather and Neat's foot oil and the particular dry warmth of a shop that had been heated by the same wood stove since before the war, which was to say it smelled the way it had always smelled, or the way Walt remembered it smelling the 2 times he had been inside, which amounted to the same thing because the smell of leather and oil was not something that changed with the years the way other smells changed. The walls were hung with bridles and headstalls and reins, most of them with red price tags. The glass case along the right wall held buckles and conchos and bits and small leather goods at what appeared from Walt's position near the door to be prices that were lower than what they should have been. There were 2 saddle trees near the back of the shop, the kind of wooden stands that held saddles at the right height for display, and both of them held saddles. And there was a 3rd saddle on a shelf above them. Walt saw the one on the shelf. He saw it the way you saw things you were not expecting to see but that you recognized before your mind had finished asking what you were looking at. The specific immediacy of recognition that bypassed analysis and arrived at certainty without the usual steps between. He walked past the saddle trees without looking at the saddles on them, and stopped below the shelf and looked up at the saddle for a long moment, and then reached up and lifted it carefully with both hands and set it on the nearest empty surface, the glass case, and stood back and looked at it. It was a stock saddle in the Texas tradition, built on a wooden tree with a 14-inch seat, the kind of saddle that had been made for working cattle in the rough country of Johnson County and the Powder River Basin since the first ranchers came north from Texas in the 1870s. The leather was dark brown with age, maintained with the oil that kept it supple, but showing the specific patina of a saddle that had been used and cared for across decades rather than displayed. The tooling on the skirts and fenders was floral, a design of roses and leaves worked in the full flower style that had been characteristic of Wyoming saddle makers in the 1920s and 1930s, before the simpler geometric styles of the post-war period had replaced it in most shops. But it was not the style that had stopped Walt. It was the corner of the right skirt, where the tooling included, embedded in the pattern of roses in a place that was not obvious unless you knew to look for it. A small image of a running horse, no larger than a silver dollar, detailed and specific, with a line beneath it that read ER-H in script. R.H. was Russell Hennessy. Russell Hennessy had been the father of the man who presumably owned this shop now, and he had been, in the estimation of every cattleman in Johnson County and Sheridan County and Bighorn County, who had worked with his saddles across a 30-year career from 1920 to 1950, the finest saddle maker in northern Wyoming. Russell Hennessy had embedded the running horse and his initials in a specific corner of the right skirt of every saddle he built, in a location that was part of the floral pattern, but that was recognizable as a maker's mark to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Walt knew because his father had told him. His father had owned a Russell Hennessy saddle, the one he had used every day from 1934 to 1957, when a horse had rolled on it in a creek crossing and cracked the tree beyond repair. Walt had been 12 years old in 1934 when his father had come home from Sheridan with the saddle and had shown him the running horse and the initials, and had said that the maker's mark was how you knew a saddle was built to last, because a man who put his name in his work was a man who was not willing to build something he would be ashamed to claim. Walt looked at the running horse in the corner of the skirt for a long time. Then he looked at the rest of the saddle with the specific attention of a man who had grown up around good leather work and who had spent 40 years using and maintaining working tack. The rigging was original and solid. The cinch rings were the heavy nickel rings that Russell Hennessy had preferred over the lighter rings that were standard in cheaper saddles. The horn was wrapped with the mule hide wrapping that Russell used on all his roping saddles. The sheepskin lining on the underside was intact and supple. The saddle was not new. It had been used, and it had been used correctly, and it had been cared for across however many years it had been in existence. And those years had been good to it, because the years had been met by good maintenance, and because the original construction was what the maker's mark said it was. A man came from the back of the shop. He was approximately Walt's age, which was to say he was in his late 50s, with the lean, weathered quality of a man who worked with his hands and who had worked with them for a long time. He looked at Walt with the expression of a man who was running a closing sale and who expected customers to be interested primarily in price rather than in looking at things carefully. Walt asked him about the saddle. The man said it was his father's work, built in 1937. He said his father had built it as a demonstration piece, the best saddle in the shop, the one he kept on the highest shelf to show what he was capable of, and that it had been on that shelf through the whole of his father's working years, and through the 12 years since his father had passed, and the saddle was still there, and now the shop was closing, and the saddle needed to go somewhere other than a shelf. Walt asked why the shop was closing. The man said what shops like this always said when they were closing in 1973, which was that the work was there, but the young people who could learn it were not, and that he had been trying to find an apprentice for 4 years and had not found one, and that his own health was not what it had been, and that the combination of those two things meant that closing was the right decision, even if it was not an easy one. He said his name was James Hennessy. His father had been Russell. Walt said his own name and said he was from Johnson County, and that his father had owned a Russell Hennessy saddle. He said the saddle had been the best piece of tack on the ranch for 23 years, and that when the tree had cracked in the creek, his father had been sorrier about the saddle than he had been about the horse. James Hennessy looked at him for a moment, and then said he remembered the name. He said his father had kept a ledger of every saddle he built, and who he built it for and what year, and that the Purdy name was in the ledger more than once. He went to the back of the shop and came back with a ledger book that was itself a piece of history. A hardbound account book with the pages yellowed and the entries in a hand that was precise and economical. The handwriting of a craftsman who kept records the way he kept everything, with specific attention to the details that mattered. He found the Purdy entries. There were 3 of them. The first was 1928, a bridle and headstall for the Purdy Ranch, Johnson County. The second was 1931, a saddle, stock design, 14-inch seat for Earl Purdy, Johnson County. The third was 1937, the demonstration saddle, the one on the shelf, which the ledger noted had been built the same year as the Earl Purdy saddle and which James had priced on the closing sale tags at $60. Walt looked at the $60 tag and then at the saddle and said that $60 was not enough for a Russell Hennessy 1937 demonstration piece in this condition. James Hennessy said he was not looking to get rich from the closing sale. He said the saddle needed to go to someone who knew what it was, and that $60 was the price he had written on the tag, and that was what he was selling it for. Walt said he wanted to pay more than $60. James said he wanted to receive $60, and that the conversation about whether that was the right price was a conversation he was not going to have, and that if Walt wanted the saddle, the price was $60, and the saddle was his. Walt paid $60 and carried the 1937 Russell Hennessy demonstration saddle out to his truck and set it carefully in the bed with his fence wire and his hydraulic fitting, and drove to the pharmacy for his wife's prescription, and then drove home to Johnson County on the road he had driven for 40 years. He put the saddle in the tack room and cleaned it with the Neat's foot oil he used on all his working tack, and looked at the running horse in the corner of the right skirt for a while, and thought about his father and about the 1931 saddle, and about the creek crossing in 1957, and about the 12 years of the saddle in the creek gravel before the water carried it to wherever it had gone. He had not recovered the 1931 saddle. It had been too far gone to repair, and he had not been able to find what was left of it before the spring runoff took it. He had always thought it was the end of the connection to Russell Hennessy's work, the specific craftsmanship that his father had prized and that he had grown up understanding as the standard for what leather work should be. He had been wrong about that. The connection had been sitting on a shelf on Main Street in Sheridan for 36 years, waiting for the moment when a man from Johnson County stopped at the curb because of a cardboard sign and went inside and recognized what he saw. James Hennessy closed the shop at the end of October. Walt had called him the week after the purchase to ask if the ledger was something James wanted to preserve, or if it was going to be dispersed with the rest of the inventory. James had said he had not thought about it. Walt had said it was a historical record of the work of one of the finest craftsmen in the region, and that it deserved to be somewhere it could be found. James had said he supposed that was right, and had asked if Walt had a suggestion. Walt had called the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne, which he had visited once with his children in the early 1960s, and which he thought of as the right kind of institution for the right kind of records. The museum had expressed interest. A curator had driven to Sheridan and had met with James, and had taken the ledger and several other records and photographs from the shop's history into the museum's collection. The 1937 demonstration saddle had stayed on Walt's tack room shelf, not on display, not under glass, but in the tack room where it was maintained and accessible in the way that a working ranch maintained all its best equipment, which was to say with care and with respect, and with the understanding that the things built to last were worth treating as though they would last. His son had asked him once, when the son was in his teens and was learning the tack room the way ranch sons learned it, why the saddle on the top shelf was never used. Walt had said it was used. The son had said he had never seen it used. Walt had said the son had not been paying attention, because the saddle was used every morning when he came into the tack room and saw it there, and knew what it was, and understood what it meant about the quality of work that a man could produce, when he took his craft seriously enough to put his name in it. The son had been quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought he understood. Walt had said good. He had handed the son the Neat's foot oil and said to make sure the 1937 saddle got its maintenance the same as everything else in the tack room. And the son had done it and had continued to do it, and had told his own children the story of the closing sale in Sheridan in October of 1973. And the cardboard sign, and the running horse in the corner of the right skirt that was only visible if you knew what you were looking for. The ledger was in the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne, in the Craft and Trades collection, accessible to researchers who wanted to understand what northern Wyoming saddle making had looked like at its best. The Hennessy name was in the index. The Purdy name was in the ledger 3 times, which was 3 times more than most names in a craft tradition that had not always been careful about its own records. The saddle was on the top shelf of the tack room on the Purdy Ranch in Johnson County. It was maintained the way Russell Hennessy had built it, which was to last. It had lasted. It would last. That was what the maker's mark said in a corner of the right skirt, where only the right person would think to look. The drive from Johnson County to Sheridan took an hour and 40 minutes on a good day. Less if you pushed the truck on the stretch of highway north of Buffalo, where the speed limit was 60 and the road was straight, and the traffic was light enough most days that the speed limit was a suggestion rather than a practical constraint. Walt had been making the drive for 40 years and knew every mile of it. Every change in the landscape, from the rolling ranch ground of Johnson County to the wider valley of the Tongue River drainage that opened up on the north side of the Big Horns and that contained Sheridan in the way a hand contained something worth keeping, sheltered from the west by the mountain front and open to the east toward the Powder River country that stretched for 200 miles with nothing in it but grass and sky, and the occasional windmill marking a stock tank. He thought about the saddle for most of the drive home. Not about its value, which was the thought that most people would have had about finding a Russell Hennessy demonstration piece at a closing sale price, because Walt was not primarily a man who thought about things in terms of their value in the financial sense. He thought about the ledger, about the 3 entries with the Purdy name and what they represented, which was 3 transactions across 9 years between his father and a craftsman who had cared enough about his work to keep a record of every piece he made and who he made it for. He thought about his father carrying the 1931 saddle for 23 years, and what 23 years of daily use said about the quality of the thing that was used. His father had not been a sentimental man. Earl Purdy had been the kind of rancher that the northern Wyoming range produced in the 1920s and 1930s, which was to say, he was practical and direct, and he did not keep things out of attachment. He kept things because they worked. A saddle that a man used every day for 23 years was a saddle that worked, and the reason it worked was in the running horse in the corner of the right skirt. The maker who had built it well enough that it outlasted most of the other things on that ranch and might have outlasted the ranch itself if the creek crossing in 1957 had gone differently. Walt had been 42 years old in 1957 when the horse went down in the creek. He had been the one riding the 1931 saddle, using it the way you used your father's tools when your father was no longer using them, because the saddle was the best on the ranch, and it fit the horses Walt used, and because there was nothing wrong with using good things for the purposes they were made for. The horse had caught its foot in a submerged root and had gone sideways into the water, and Walt had gone with it and come up unhurt, but the saddle had taken the full weight of the horse in the fall, and the tree had cracked through. And when Walt had gotten the saddle off the horse and looked at it, he had known from the feel of it that the crack was through the gullet, and that no repair was going to bring it back to what it had been. He had carried the saddle to the bank, and had set it down, and had looked at it, and had felt, at 42 years old, the specific grief of a practical man over the loss of a practical thing that had been something more than practical. And then he had gotten back on the horse and ridden back to the ranch, and that had been the end of the 1931 saddle. Or so he had thought. He put the 1937 demonstration saddle in the tack room on a Tuesday evening in October of 1973, cleaned it and noted its condition, and hung it on the top hook of the back wall where the best tack went. And he did not tell his wife Edna about the $60 until dinner, when she asked about the supplies, and he told her about the fence wire, and the hydraulic fitting and the pharmacy and the saddle shop. She had said $60 was not a bad price for a good saddle. He had said it was about half what it should have been. She had asked why he had paid $60 instead of arguing for the right price. He had told her what James Hennessy had said about the price and about the conversation he was not going to have. She had been quiet for a moment and then had said that James Hennessy sounded like his father's son. Walt had said yes, that was about right. The conversation about the ledger had happened the following week, and the call to the Wyoming State Museum the week after that, and the curator's visit to Sheridan in early November. And through all of it, Walt had kept the tack room routine the same, because the tack room routine was what the tack room required. And the saddle on the top hook was now part of what the tack room required, which was maintenance on the same schedule as everything else, and acknowledgement on the same terms as the other best things in the room, which was to say, you knew what they were, and you treated them accordingly. His wife had come to the tack room in December, the first December after the purchase, and had looked at the 1937 saddle on the top hook, and had asked if he was going to tell her the whole story of it, or just the parts he had told her over dinner. He had told her the rest of it, the 1931 saddle and the creek crossing, and the feeling at 42 when he had set the cracked tree on the bank and known it was finished, and what it had meant to find the 1937 demonstration piece on the shelf in a closing shop 36 years later. She had listened to all of it. When he finished, she had said she thought the saddle had been on that shelf for 36 years because it was waiting for the right person to come through the door, and that the right person had been Walt, and that this was the kind of thing that happened sometimes if you paid attention. He had said he was not sure he believed in that kind of thing. She had said she was not sure he had to believe in it for it to be true. He had thought about that for a while and had not entirely settled it, but had decided that the part of it that was definitely true was that paying attention to a cardboard sign in a shop window on Main Street in Sheridan had produced something that 100 other drives past that same window had not produced. And that if there was a lesson in it, the lesson was probably about the paying attention, rather than about any larger arrangement of events. Edna had said that sounded like him. The Wyoming State Museum had sent a letter of acknowledgement in January of 1974, thanking Walt for the referral that had brought the Hennessy records into their collection, and describing the accession in the specific formal language of institutional record keeping. Walt had filed the letter in the farm office and had thought no more about it until 1981, when a researcher from the University of Wyoming's American Studies program had contacted him through the museum to ask if she could interview him about the Russell Hennessy saddle and the family connection to the craftsman's work. He had agreed to the interview, which had taken place in the tack room on a Saturday morning in April, with the 1937 saddle on the top hook behind both of them. The researcher had asked good questions and had taken photographs of the saddle and the maker's mark, and had included the interview in a monograph about Wyoming craft traditions that was published by the University Press in 1983, and that contained a photograph of the running horse in the corner of the right skirt, with Walt's hand beside it for scale. Walt had read the monograph when his copy arrived in the mail. He had found it accurate in the details that he could verify and measured in its claims about the things he could not verify, which was the appropriate approach for a scholarly treatment of a craft tradition that had left incomplete records behind. He had put it on the shelf in the farm office and had gone back to the ranch work, which was what the ranch work required regardless of what was on the shelves. The tack room had changed over the years the way tack rooms changed on working ranches, which was in response to the animals and the work rather than by any deliberate plan, new equipment accumulating and old equipment being retired or repaired, and the whole room adjusting to what the operation needed at each stage. Through all of it, the top hook on the back wall had held the 1937 Russell Hennessy demonstration saddle in the same position it had held since October of 1973, maintained on the same schedule as everything else, acknowledged on the same terms, present in the specific way that the best things in a working space were present, which was functionally rather than decoratively. Walt Purdy died in 1998 at 83 years old, on the ranch in Johnson County where he had been born, surrounded by the work of a life that had been spent doing what the land required and maintaining what was worth maintaining. The ranch passed to his son, who had grown up knowing the 1937 saddle and the story of the closing sale and the ledger and the creek crossing in 1957, and who maintained the saddle on the same hook in the same tack room on the same schedule, because that was what the saddle required, and because what things required was the standard the Purdy Ranch had always used. The monograph from 1983 was in the farm office. The letter from the Wyoming State Museum was in the file. The 3 entries in Russell Hennessy's ledger were in the museum's collection in Cheyenne, accessible to anyone who knew to look for them. The saddle was in the tack room, dark brown and supple, the floral tooling as clear as it had been in 1937, the running horse in the corner of the right skirt exactly where Russell Hennessy had put it, in a place that required knowing what you were looking for to find it. Walt had known what he was looking for because his father had told him to look for it, and had explained what it meant when you found it. He had passed the same knowledge to his son in the tack room on a morning when the son was learning how to care for leather, and had asked why the saddle on the top shelf was never used. The son had told his own children. The knowledge was still traveling. That was how the best kinds of knowledge traveled. From one person who understood it to the next person who was willing to pay the kind of attention that understanding required. The saddle on the shelf in the clothing shop in 1973 had been waiting for that kind of attention. It had found it. It would continue to find it, as long as someone in the family remembered to go to the tack room and look at the top hook and understand what was hanging there and why.